You're here to talk about Pine Martens. The sparrow thing was a joke. You're here for Pine Martens, and by the sounds of it, lots of you are quite excited about Pine Martens, which is great. We've got a full room here. We've got people watching online, so hello everyone. Hello Mum, if you're watching. My mum won't be watching. In fact, I think there's people even tuned in the offices around us, so no pressure at all. I hope you enjoy it. We're here, of course, to talk about Pine Martens because Pine Martens are now back in Gloucestershire after an absence of at least a century. It's a big, very exciting thing. It's been a very exciting project. I'm proud to be the Pine Marten Project Manager leading on this project nowadays. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Pine Martens, about their history, about their return to Gloucestershire, and hopefully about where we're going to go with them next. Well, I suppose where we're going to go with them next, where these guys are going to go next. It is largely up to them. So we will see. I've titled this talk Return of the Pine Marten, which sounds like a catchy title, sounds quite snappy, but I thought it could do with jazzing up a little bit, so I changed the slide a while back. I wonder if I should replace that permanently, but yeah. First of all, and I might well be preaching to the converted here, but the first thing we ought to cover is what on earth a Pine Marten is, because something that I found when I took over this role was that an awful lot of people don't know. A lot of people think it's a bird, or a person perhaps a previous Springwatch presenter. But no, of course, the Pine Marten in question is this chap in the middle. There is a story, in fact, that the spelling of Martin with an E instead of an I was put there to differentiate from birds and Springwatch presenters, so that people don't get too confused. But this is a Pine Marten in the middle. It's a mammal we're talking about. It's not just any mammal. It's a member of quite a familiar family to us in the UK. It's one of the mustelids, the Mustelidae. The same family that includes the, well, here they are here, the badger, the otter, the polecat, the stoat, and the weasel. There's the Pine Marten sat there quite happily at the top. I'm a big fan of the mustelids. I've now worked with every one of those in some form or fashion, and they're all lovely blokes. Yeah, I like to think of them as sort of the Swiss Army knife of the mammal world, for a very good reason, because they've sort of got a mustelid for every occasion. We've got the fossorial badger that lives down underground. We've got the amphibious otter. And in the case of the Pine Marten, obviously, these guys live up in the trees. There's a mustelid for every occasion. We've got 6 mustelids in the UK, as I said. Generally, you can tell a mustelid by the fact that they've got quite similar body features. You can see, comparing them side by side there, that they're all generally quite long and sleek. Quite sweet, really, all of them. The badger is perhaps a little bit bulkier than the rest, and indeed, long ago, before we understood more about genetics and taxonomy, the badger was originally classified as a bear, which if you've ever seen a badger, I've worked with badgers up close, I get that, I do understand it. But no, they are mustelids too. The Pine Marten is this chap in the middle, that's the one we're talking about today, is one of 8 marten species across the world, and together with the fisher, the taira, and the wolverine, they form a complex, something we call the Martes complex. The reason basically we invite these other 3 in is because they don't have many other close relatives. So those of us who do study and work on the Martes species, the Martens across the world, we like to invite these along for Christmas dinners and conferences and things like that. We don't like to let them to feel left out. But they're all quite sweet, aren't they? But the chap we're dealing with is this handsome Pine Marten in the middle. The European Pine Marten, I've already mentioned the fact that these guys are associated with trees. They're an arboreal species, or at least a semi-arboreal species. They do at least sleep and den and breed in trees, but they will utilise other habitats too. The name Pine Marten, though, a little bit of a misnomer there, a little bit misleading. If anything, it denotes the fact that this is a species we'd associate more with more northerly climates where you'd find more pine forests, but they're far from pine specific. What they want is mature trees which have those natural cavities in them which they'll den and breed in. They couldn't care less which sort of tree it is. So the Pine Marten bit is a bit of a misnomer. It also helps to differentiate them from their cousins. You might have seen on the previous slide, the stone martens, also known as beech martens. Again, not beech specific, but we'd associate them more with more southerly climes where you get more beech forests. We're getting too complicated now. Anyway, as I said, they don't just use woodland. Really, the woodland is there for them to den and breed in. That's the main use of those mature trees. They like a woodland with a nice complex understory in which they can hunt. And they'll also venture outside of woodland into rough grassland, into scrubland to hunt and forage, because these guys have got quite a broad diet. They're what we call an opportunistic omnivore, which basically means they eat whatever they can wherever they find it. I do that some days and it works wonderfully well. But I could do with maybe a bigger shirt soon. But nevertheless, yeah, it's a very, very effective strategy. Lots of species employ it. Red foxes are a great example of that. They're one of the most successful mammals on the planet because they eat whatever they find, wherever they find it. And it suits pine martens well. So their diet now includes mainly small mammals. Their favourite things are voles. They'll also eat birds and eggs and insects and fruits and berries and all sorts of stuff. That diet, therefore, obviously varies seasonally, it varies geographically, and it means that they're quite an adaptable species. That's why, as I said, they'll venture outside of woodland to go and hunt for voles and mice in scrubland or in rough grassland too. It says here, and I regret putting this on the slide at times, that they're relatively long-lived. Now, I never like to give an estimate for the longevity, the lifespan of a wild animal, because it's very hard to know. Most of the time, if animals die in the wild, we've got no idea where or when it happened, or it's difficult data to get hold of. But what we generally say, and I'm going to give you a figure now, and you're not going to ask me about it again, for pine martens is that they generally live about 7 or 8 years. But they're slow to reproduce. What I mean by that is they don't start thinking about breeding until they're at least 2 or 3, depending on their sex. So assuming you're going to make it to 7 or 8, that's a fair chunk of the way through your life you've got to get before you start thinking about producing the next generation. The reason I'm mentioning that is because that's relevant and we'll come back to it. But as I said, you've got to survive for 2 or 3 years before you even start thinking about producing the next generation. And you run a risk there. You do run a risk. Unless they are thinking about the next generation, they're usually solitary animals. And well, it's lunchtime, so I've got to be polite. They're usually solitary animals. If you ever are lucky enough to encounter a pine marten, you'll probably see one by itself. Though from springtime through the summer months, you may encounter a female with her kits. When kits are born, they're born around February, March, April time, and they will stick with mum in her territory, learning the ropes of how to be a pine marten for most of that summer, maybe into the next autumn. But later on in the year, she'll be pregnant again with the next lot, and she'll soon see shot of them. So you might get the chance to see them together. Pine martens also exhibit a wonderfully neat biological trick known as delayed implantation. Now this is quite a neat trick, as I say, because they're solitary animals, and we see this in animals that tend to live alone. They can't guarantee when they're going to bump into a member of the opposite sex. It's lunchtime, so I'm going to say this as politely as possible. So whenever they do bump into one, it's the best thing to do is to make the most of the opportunity, shall we say. But that could be at any point during the year, really. Nevertheless, the best time to produce kits and raise them is the spring, the following spring. So no matter when they've mated, they need to somehow guarantee that they're still going to give birth to those kits at the right time of year. So they delay the implantation of that embryo until around January, February time, so about now. And then they'll carry their kits to term and give birth to them in March or April time. It's a very cool little trick. Interestingly, badgers do that too. Badgers, which aren't a solitary animal, but it suggests that maybe they were. But that's a story for another day. So pine martens used to be all over the UK. They were much more widespread than they are now, largely because their habitat was much more widespread than it is now. What I'm talking about there is really that woodland cover. As you'll be aware, I'm sure the UK used to have a lot more woodland in it, but we've soon seen to that. Over the last few centuries, indeed the last few millennia, we've cleared an awful lot of the woodland habitat, and that's been the driver of the decline of lots of species, the pine marten among them, but certainly not unique. I could stand up here and talk about any species in Britain, a lot of species across the world even, and I'd be talking about the same key issues. Habitat loss is a big, big issue for lots and lots of species, and it meant that the pine marten has suffered quite a severe decline over the last few centuries. That's been compounded by the fact that they're one of those species we just love to kill. We like to kill lots of things, but pine martens historically have suffered for that since we're going right back to the Tudor Vermin Acts of the 1500s. All the way through to the rise of the game shooting industry, where predators, particularly things like pine martens, potentially pose a threat to people's livelihoods and to game birds, so they've been persecuted as a result. Now what we were left with then by the 1960s, as you'll see on this map, is a scattering of pine martens across the UK. We've got a few across Wales, and this really is generous. Some up in the north of England and perhaps the southern areas of Scotland, but really the only decent, and I use decent very lightly here, population that was left is right up in the north, in the Highlands of Scotland. Come the 1980s, the Wildlife and Countryside Act enshrined some legal protection for pine martens, among other species, but the pine martens were very grateful for it. From then on, it is illegal to recklessly or intentionally kill or disturb pine martens or their denning spaces. So if I support your weekend plans there, I do apologise, but you're not allowed to do it, all right? And what we've seen as a result of that is a gradual, it has been gradual, natural recovery. As soon as you take that pressure off of the population, we've seen some gradual expansion, at least in Scotland. If you look at the top of those maps, you can see that that Scottish population has recovered slightly, started to recolonise parts of their former range. Not so much in the rest of the UK, where sadly those populations in England and Wales were really too small to be functional. By the time you get to a population that small, you have too few individuals to maintain that genetic resilience and resilience to anything else that comes their way. So these populations didn't really last, and you can see by the 2010s, by the 2010s, I should say, they had largely dwindled. Up in Scotland, though, it's looking quite good by the 2010s. That is largely down to the natural expansion, but there were also people giving them a helping hand. Pine martens, you see, I've already mentioned, they're relatively slow breeders. They don't start breeding until they're 2 or 3 years old, assuming they get there first. So this natural recovery is only ever going to be gradual. And the other thing, of course, that we mentioned, the other big driver for their decline is that lack of habitat. So they can only expand as far as the habitat extends. And nowadays, as we've already said, it doesn't extend very far at all. There might be big, decent patches of viable pine marten habitat spread out across the UK, but they are few and they are very far between, too far for pine martens to colonise naturally. That's where people like us come in, and we go in and pick up some pine martens and say, come with us, and we move them to these new areas. These areas, I say new areas, they're not really new for pine martens, they used to be there. And we put them back in these areas. Why bother though? Why bother? It's always a valid question, and I always sort of wince slightly when somebody asks me it, because it's a difficult question perhaps to ask. I feel like you've got to go right back to the beginning. But no, I think nowadays it's generally becoming more and more accepted, and something we talk about a lot more, that the need to restore our lost biodiversity is crucial. Our ecosystems in Britain are missing quite a number of species. If you think of an ecosystem like an engine, when they go all their parts together, they perform as they should. They perform certain functions. I've talked about ecosystem functions there. All of these natural processes, many of which benefit us. It seems a sad state of affairs that nowadays we often have to phrase things in terms of how they benefit us, but we do. We talk about ecosystem services, things like pollination and air quality and flood prevention. All of these things are natural benefits of having fully functional ecosystems, but they only really happen when you've got all the parts there. If I take a few parts out of my car's engine, and it's probably missing a few now, you'll see it parked out there on the mud, it might get me from A to B just about, but I'll lose the aircon, the radio, and at some point it's going to break down. That's the state that our ecosystems are in, and so are ecosystems across the world. They're missing quite a few pieces, which are important in the general functionality, ecologically speaking. Some of those pieces, particularly in Britain, we're quite bad for this, have been gone so long we don't even know they're gone. I mean, I'm sure if you looked at my car, they'll say you're supposed to have a handbrake there or something like that. I'd have had no idea. But species like the pine marten, species like the beaver, which we're putting back now, but wind back 20 years, if you spoke to most of the general public out there, you go, we're going to bring back the beaver. They go, bring back the beaver? I didn't know beavers were British. Pine martens are exactly the same. As I said, most people don't know what they are. These species have been gone so long that we're scarcely aware they were ever here in the first place. Nevertheless, they do have important roles within that ecosystem engine that I talked about before. In terms of the pine marten, well, they're what we call a mesocarnivore, mesopredator. They're not the apex predator. They don't sit at the top of the ecosystem, of the trophic web. They sit somewhere in the middle because some things eat them, so they don't get to rule the roost. But they also, with that broad diet, influence lots of other populations of other species. So as I mentioned, they eat lots of small mammals. They'll eat birds. They'll eat fruits and berries as well. Because they interact with so many other populations. By monitoring pine martens, we are in a way taking the pulse of the ecosystem. If pine martens start to drop, then perhaps there's an issue in one of their prey populations. If they start to do particularly well, then perhaps their prey population is doing particularly well as well. We can start to discern things about other species by monitoring pine martens. Also, yes, they're an omnivore, but they're crucially an opportunistic omnivore. What that means is they will generally eat whatever's easiest, whatever's most readily available. And so if a pine marten walks into a new woodland and there's loads and loads and loads of field voles, not so many bank voles and yellow-necked mice, these guys will munch their way through whatever's most readily available, allowing that population to drop and the other rodent population who were competing to rise again. And what they do thereby is rebalance these prey populations. That rebalancing is quite important in, as I said, these ecosystems which are missing lots of pieces and are nowhere near in the state that they once were. There's also, and I heard about this, it was proposed not that long ago, that pine martens and their relatives might have quite an important role in seed dispersal. I mentioned that they eat fruits and berries. Well, those seeds come out the other end as well. And as these guys are moving around, perhaps they also have a role in helping to replant and regenerate their forest habitats. So these guys have got a lot to be thanked for. So, we've already mentioned that these guys have a low reproductive rate, which means that natural population recovery is quite slow. The habitat that is left, though some of it's pretty good quality, is in fragments. Some of them are really good, but they're miles and miles, if not hundreds of miles apart. So this is why translocations become necessary. We need to give them a helping hand to move to these other areas. Back in 2015, there was a reinforcement of the very small number of pine martens that lingered on in Mid Wales, carried out by Vincent Wildlife Trust. The Mid Wales population, as I said, was very, very small, very, very low in number. 16 unequivocal sightings from 1990 to 2015. Pine martens are elusive, but that's quite low. These were living in very low numbers, but we think they were subsisting to some extent. So Vincent Wildlife Trust moved 51 animals down to the forest, down to the area of Mid Wales. Those guys are now doing wonderfully. They're breeding every year and they're expanding nicely. Well, we look at projects like that. We thought, that's a good idea. Why don't we do something like that? So, and you'll like this title. I'm just going to have a drink while you enjoy that. I hope there's more like that coming because that got a good laugh. Anyway. Why the why? Why did we bother with that area? Well, the Forest of Dean and the Lower Wye Valley are obviously, first of all, a big area of mixed woodland. This map over here, which is not the clearest on this screen, I grant you, came from our ecological feasibility study. And what you see there, the green areas, are areas of woodland identified as highly suitable for pine martens. There's quite a bit of it. The yellow, which there's still a fair chunk of, is suitable, and the red stuff is the edge habitat. But that is pretty good looking. Straight away looking at that map, I might get that printed out and put on my wall, maybe a tattoo on my arm or something. I think it's a good looking map. That's fantastic. We've got about 170 square kilometres of suitable woodland down in the Forest of Dean. Also, thinking about where that forest is, we've got potential for connectivity with that Mid Wales population I just mentioned. We did some interesting prey studies. It's another important thing to look at. Is there going to be plenty of food for these martens to eat if we put them back? Well, absolutely there was. There were more mammals, and I'm talking 3 or 4 times as many small mammals as have been found in other parts of Europe where pine martens are doing perfectly well. So we've got lots of food, lots of prey, potential for connectivity and meet another pine marten population. From an ecological perspective, we're looking good. But just as important with any reintroduction project is the social side of things. We could have just turned up and said, here you are, here's your pine martens. But we've got to ask the local people first what they think. Anybody here come over from the forest today? Yeah? See, it's important that people are engaged, because otherwise, if I turned up on your doorstep with 45 pine martens, you wouldn't have liked it. Oh, well, I know where to send them. I know where to send them. See, it's important that you ask the general public and any other stakeholders. I'm talking about landowners, I'm talking about game shoots in the area. We've already mentioned that there's been some historical conflict or aggravation perhaps between gamekeepers and pine martens. So it's absolutely necessary to address these things. Well, we were really pleased with that as well. We had about 80% support from the general public straight away. That's fantastic. That's pretty good to go. We'll look into this in more depth in a minute, but we had pretty good, pretty much a green light from a social perspective. I will show you a cool graph, which again I might get tattooed, maybe down my leg, in a bit. But from an ecological perspective, as I said, we have an abundance of rodents. We've got a relatively low fox density. Foxes are one of the only remaining predators of pine martens in Britain. Before you ask, I don't know why there's a relatively low fox density in the Forest of Dean. Everybody always asks that one, and I still don't know, so don't ask. And as I said, there's potential for connectivity with the whales population. It's not all good news, of course. We have got a substantial road network in the Forest of Dean, though that nowadays is largely unavoidable in most of the UK. It's perhaps one of the reasons why pine martens lingered on as well as they did do in the Highlands of Scotland, is that that's perhaps one of the most least accessible parts of the UK. It's a sad state of affairs when a species only survives because we can't get to it. But nevertheless, a substantial road network in the forest is potentially an issue to our pine martens, and as I mentioned, concerns about predation of pheasants. But we'll come on to that. From a social perspective, this is that graph, that gorgeous graph. I promised you a gorgeous graph, and here it is. About 80% of people, this is the yes camp. These are all the people who said yes. These first three columns are the general public. This is, 89% from the community meetings. Lots and lots of people very pro Pine Marten. There was obviously more concern from the gamekeeping community. This is BASC, the British Association for Shooting and Conservation, and the NGO, the National Gamekeepers Organisation. It's a mouthful, I'm going to need a drink again in a minute. Still, nearly 50% of these people were positive, were saying yes. We had some no's, quite a few undecided. And we've continued to work with those groups ever since. It's not we're going, oh, well, forget you then. We have to work with these people, allay their concerns. As I said, for a lot of people, this is a species they're not that familiar with because they've not been here in so long. So we need to talk to them, tell them what pine martens are like, what they will and won't do. In Scotland and in Ireland, where pine martens have never totally disappeared, there are gamekeepers and lots of other landowners living alongside pine martens quite comfortably. So this was something that we've been able to work with these groups on. So among the concerns that were raised, obviously game birds, we put guidance in place. We've talked to a lot of these landowners, and we still are. Grey squirrels. How have we got this far and not talked about grey squirrels yet? And none of you have mentioned grey squirrels. Sometimes you do get all the way to the end and nobody mentions grey squirrels, but I'll address it now. Grey squirrels are a small mammal. So as far as a pine marten is concerned, yes, that's an option for lunch. Naturally, pine martens would predate their native squirrel species in the UK, the red squirrel. And in areas where we've got red and grey squirrels, in Scotland and in Ireland perhaps, and you've got pine martens, what we see is that the pine martens preferentially eat the grey squirrels. Any Americans in today? Generally, the grey squirrels get eaten preferentially because they're bigger, they're slower, they spend more time on the ground. I had to check it before I went too far in on that one. And they're more easily caught than the red squirrels. So the pine, who have been living alongside pine martens for millions of years, they know how to get along to the end of the branches and keep out their way. So what we see is a drop in the grey squirrel population, who themselves pose more of a threat to the reds than the pine martens do, through competition and through disease. As the grey squirrels drop, therefore, the reds are released from that competition and from that suppression, and we see an increase in the red population. It perhaps initially seems counterintuitive that a predator can cause an increase in one of its prey species. But as I said, as far as the pine marten is concerned, it's not its only source of prey. They're just another part of their diet. So there's been a lot of excitement, and I suspect that's why that graph looked the way it did. In some ways, they're also very sweet, obviously, and cuddly, and it's nice to bring species back. But I think the grey squirrel situation has got a lot of people very excited, and I understand that. But of course, in the centuries past, since pine martens have been absent from the forest, people have had to take the grey squirrel issue into their own hands. So now we've got landowners across the area, across the country, dealing with squirrels in their own way, be it through trapping or shooting or whatever they might be doing. Now, pine martens are back. Those methods might now pose a threat to the pine martens. So it's something we've had to be considerate of, and we have to work with those landowners, adapt the methods that they're using, advise them to avoid lethal traps, avoid poisons and things like that. And we provided guidance. We've written up some lovely leaflets, you should see them. And given these out through BASC and through the NGO to landowners, to gamekeepers, to anybody who's doing any kind of squirrel trapping, in order to keep our pine martens safe and to reassure them that, look, the pine martens are eating the squirrels, they are. As I said though, it's important to remember that the pine marten, The grey squirrel is one option on its menu. They've got no idea there's this pressure on them to eat the lot. But they are working on it. We've got proof of it on camera that they're eating the squirrels, so don't worry. There was some concern about birds. Birds form a natural part of a pine marten diet, and so particularly with birds in nest boxes. So we've been working on some quite nice little solutions to protect nesting birds from pine martens. I quite like this one. It looks like a toilet roll tube stuck on the front with a little, I don't know if you can, there's a little ladder there. So the bird can hold on and climb in and out the box, but quite simply the pine marten can't get his hand in like that. Wonderfully simple solution. It's often the case with these sorts of things when it seems like big and bad and you've reintroduced a predator and it's and you know there are potential conflicts. So often there are quite simple solutions like that. And finally, bats. There was some concern about the bat population in the Forest of Dean, which boasts quite significant populations of greater and lesser horseshoe bats. Lots and lots of these bats. And there was concern, of course, that pine martens, should they enter one of these roosts, could pose quite a threat to the population. It had been observed in some old Nazi war tunnels, actually, over in Poland. That was the reason for this concern, was that there was a population of around 40,000 bats over in Poland, and the local pine and stone martens, only a few individuals, had found their way in there and had a lovely time. Nevertheless, they didn't eat that many, and the concern in the forest was that they might wander into these roosts and start on our bats. So what we've done, we've worked closely with Vincent Wildlife Trust, one of our main project partners, they are mammal experts, particularly good with bats. They went round and have been monitoring the known roosts in and around the forest. They provided mitigation measures where necessary. By that I mean predator proofing to stop pine martens accessing any of these roosts, and we've been monitoring them ever since. I've been working with caving groups and bat groups and training them to look out for pine marten signs, just in case any pine marten should ever enter a bat roost. I should say at this point that we don't think they will, because there is ample food, as we said, above ground. There's plenty for them to eat above ground, yes. Roosts, as I said, we put in predator proofing on any of the roosts where it was available, and we've been monitoring them ever since. We don't think the pine martens will enter the roosts, and so far they haven't. But we've got a mitigation process in place should that happen, and as I said, we're still working with everybody involved. So then we came to the translocation itself. We've got to be at least half an hour in now, and we're just getting to the fun bit. So this is where we move the martens themselves. It's a big effort, a translocation like this. Involves a lot of partners across 3 different countries. We've been working across England, Scotland and Wales. We have to get licenses involved. We have to get landowners involved. We have to get funding. We have to get all sorts of processes enacted to move pine martens down from Scotland to the Forest of Dean. And of course, I've just given away, the source population was of course those Scottish martens. British martens are genetically quite distinct from those in mainland Europe and in Ireland too, so for now at least, reintroduced populations in Britain come from this Scottish population. So we went up there, did some surveys. If you all had your lunch, because there's the first pictures of poo in this talk. So yes, we did some surveys to establish exactly where the best area to take some martens from was, how many we could viably take, how many we wanted. We were aiming for a population of about 40 to start our new population down in the forest. So we need to find an area in Scotland where we could viably take about 40 without denting the local population up there. There's lots to consider in this process. Which martens do you want? Well, we want a healthy population, obviously. We're about to found a new population down here in the Forest of Dean. So we want some nice young and fit martens. We want a nice balance of males and females. No great gender skew. How many do we want? Well, we've talked about, I said we were aiming for about 40. That was our founder population that we were going to work with. How to think about the weather conditions. We're late summer, early autumn, up in the north of Scotland, trying to trap pine martens in a cage. It's fun work. And you don't want a marten sat in a trap for a couple of hours before you come and check on him in the pouring rain. I know they're Scottish martens, they're probably used to it, but nevertheless, it's something we have to consider. And then the logistics of what you do with the martens afterwards. So, the trapping itself is quite a straightforward process. Basically, we use a nice little mix of this. If you haven't had your lunch yet, this is going to make you hungry. A nice mix of peanuts and raisins and eggs and jam. And we lay that out in a clearing in the forest and get the martens used to coming down. Then gradually we introduce them to the cages. They get used to coming and taking the bait from the cages. And one night, we set those traps. He steps in and the door closes behind him. We've broken his trust, I grant you. but it's all in the name of his species, so it's all fine in the end. If only, I always feel when we're working with animals like this, if only you could explain what you're doing. There's some more trapping pictures there. It's just people putting eggs in cages. It's not that exciting. Now this is something I didn't think you would have expected to see when you woke up this morning. A pine marten on a chopping board. But nevertheless, that's what we're dealing with. This is because these pine martens, as I said, need to be young and fit and healthy. So we have to give them health checks. We worked with some wonderful vets and made sure these pine martens were nice and happy and healthy and going to form a viable founder population down here in the Forest of Dean. They were tagged with microchips in the back of their neck, just like your dogs and cats are, and they were given their clearance to travel down. This is a nice opportunity as well to get some close-up views of pine martens. This is when we popped into the local dentist to see if they needed any fillings. I joke, of course, this is the best way, or one of the best ways, of gauging the age in quite a few wild mammals, really. If an animal dies in the wild of old age, it's often because their teeth are worn out and they can't eat anymore. So the gradual wearing of their teeth and the extent to which their teeth are worn can be used as an indicator of how old an animal might be. You can see the animal up here. I'm going to jump over here and make it exciting. This one, nice and young, nice healthy teeth. All right, he's chipped a canine here, but you know, we can talk to his dentist or his mum about that. And but these are nice, healthy, pointy teeth. This guy's good to go. This one, not so much. Clearly a much older individual, and this one didn't end up coming down with us. It's also an opportunity to take these mug shots, in a way. These patterns on the pine marten's throat are what we call the bib patterns, and they are unique to individuals, a bit like fingerprints. This is probably the best view of that bib pattern you're ever going to get. Getting this shot again in the wild is proving quite tricky. But nevertheless, in theory, if you record each of these bib patterns, you can note down the name of each one. We put a lot of thought into these names, Forest of Dean 19 and Forest of Dean 15, and then you can identify the individuals later on. They were also fitted with VHF radio collars. Now these are a wonderful piece of kit. I usually have one in my pocket and I don't. But it looks like that. Basically, all the fancy electronic stuff is here in this bit. It's a battery and it sends out a beep on a given frequency. The Marten wears it for about six months to a year. The strap is made of bridle leather, so it's designed to weather and fall off in the end. And this enables us to track those martens for those first few months post-release to see exactly where they go and where they set up territories. Once they're all checked and blinged up, then it's time to move them down from Scotland. It's a long old way, about 9-hour drive there. And we had vets stationed all the way along that route, just in case anything went wrong. We'd suggested getting pubs stationed along the route as well, but no luck there. They weren't moving on that one. They said, you need to get on. We travelled them down 4 at a time in the back of our trusty van, which still rattles around the forest tracks today. And fed them blueberries. There you are. There's a little superfluous detail, but a nice one nonetheless. Meanwhile, back in the forest, on Forester England's land, we've been sorting out our release sites. Now, at this point, have I got it? No, I haven't. I used to have a picture of an egg here. Has anybody ever seen one of my talks before? No? Good, okay. I removed the egg slide, but I've mentioned it now, so I'm going to have to explain it. I used to have an egg here because when it comes to releases, we categorise them into hard and soft, and that was what the egg was there for. Is that funny? No, that's why I removed it, okay? Anyway, we had decided to give these martens a soft release. What I mean by a soft release is that we give them a gradual transition into their new environment. So we build them a temporary enclosure, put them in there for a few days, and then let them go, as opposed to a hard release, which is just bye-bye. It's not quite like that, you know, but you know what I mean. So we had to select our release sites down in the forest. We wanted places that were similar to where we got the martens from, with lots of abundant natural resting places nearby. After that 9-hour journey, after their few days in the release enclosure, we wanted them to be able to get out and just go and rest and take in their new home. So it was important that we were very careful selecting these sites. Thankfully, as I said, the Forest of Dean is a wonderful example of pine marten habitat and was therefore full of quite viable sites. Then it came to the release. This is where the egg was, but you've heard that joke now. These are the release enclosures that we built. They're basically large aviaries, and I'm in the process of bringing them down again now because we don't need them anymore. We've got all our martens back. And in there they are kitted out with lots of foliage, and this gives these martens just a few days to sit calmly with food and board provided they're quite happy to sit there and adjust to their new environment. We monitor them while they're in there with trail cameras. That's where these sorts of photographs come from. So if they're showing any health concerns or any behavioural issues, anything like that, we can get in there and help them out. And then, after those 5 days, I always think we need a drum roll at this point. Here's the big moment. That is it. There we are. Look, we got a bit of a drum roll. Thanks, guys. I need sound effects. Yeah, forget the egg. He's long gone. This is wonderful. This is just brilliant. This is the first pole step of a Pine Marten on the Forest of Dean floor for I can't tell you how long. It's a wonderful, wonderful moment. And if you look on that Pine Marten's face, he couldn't care less. He's got no idea at all of how significant this moment is. There were no special words. There was no one small step for Martin or anything like that. We didn't media train these guys before they went. Nevertheless, that was it. That was fantastic. This was the big moment. And at this point, we could have washed our hands and gone to the pub. I wish we had, because I'd be there now. But anyway, how much more time have we got? Because we've got
25 minutes.
25 minutes. Fantastic, fantastic. You thought you were getting away with that, weren't you? Because it's not enough, of course, just to release these animals and say, brilliant, that's that done. No, we need to see that these guys survive and that they continue to be successful in this new area. So that's where it comes to post-release monitoring. That is the phase of the project we are in now. The post-release monitoring phase, as I said, is vital. It helps us. It means that we can track exactly where these martens go, how many of them survive, do they breed, all these exciting questions. And of course, we started that with radio tracking. This is my predecessor, Cat McNichol, back when I was a Scottish lady. And she's out there listening to Radio 2 somewhere in the forest. Now, this is the process of radio tracking. I should have brought the antenna along with me, really, to show you, but basically it looks like that. And as I said, it's basically a means of walking around the forest and picking up the beeps from these Pine Marten radio collars. From those beeps, you can triangulate roughly where they are. And by tracking these martens over the first few months post-release, we're able to build up quite a good picture of exactly where they went and exactly where they settled in that time. Den boxes are another very effective way of monitoring martens. These den boxes were installed to supplement the denning spaces that are available in the forest. I've already said we had lots of viable habitat, so there should, in theory, be lots of viable denning spaces for them. But we put out about 62 den boxes, about 62. I say about, thinking it's going to be a rough figure, and then I give you the specific 62. Anyway, about 62 den boxes across the forest, again, to provide some extra opportunities for denning and for breeding in. So far, they've hardly touched them. They use these den boxes quite extensively in other parts of the forest, but in other parts of the country, I should say, but in the Forest of Dean, there are so many natural denning opportunities, they haven't yet needed them. So it's bad news, but it's good news. It's really good news. The only way in which this is bad news is that every breeding season, I trudge around the forest in the van with a thermal imager checking every empty box to no avail. And of course, if they're not breeding in those boxes, but they are breeding, because we've had that confirmed, I don't know where they're doing it. They're out, it's a needle in a haystack job there, and I can't go around hoping to find them. So one day, hopefully, they might use some of these boxes just so I can get a glimpse of what exactly they're up to. But for now, I know that they're up to it, just not on view. Fine. So yes, these den boxes are out there. You might see these around the forest. We've got the bigger VWT boxes out there. They're generally on the bigger trees, and the smaller Galloway lights. These boxes are really are useful in areas where you don't have mature trees. So particularly in parts of the forest where you've got commercial, particularly coniferous plantations. You've got younger, slimmer trees without those natural cavities which form later on. So, and maybe never will if they're felled, obviously, before they get the chance. So that's what these den boxes are really there for. But so far, what they have provided opportunities for is blue tits. I could go on. There's quite a few birds breed in these boxes instead. So there we are. Counterintuitively, we're helping the birds as well. We check these boxes, as I said, with a thermal imager. This is quite a fun thing to do. If you get a nice warm glow on a box like this, it's usually an indicator of Pine Martens. As I said, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a bird's nest. But they're quite nice. You get some wonderful shots of Pine Martens through the thermal imager. It goes to show quite how well insulated they are. They're giving off heat, in these, you know, around the face and around the arms. But if you look at a person on one of these thermal imagers, they do too. Interestingly, for a northern adapted species, Pine Martens aren't that well adapted for the colder weather. Their fur is not quite as thick as you might think it would be. In the winter, rather to keep themselves a little bit warmer, they'll curl up and wrap themselves around them like a little cat, which I think is quite sweet. The other, one of the other forms of post-release monitoring is camera trapping. Anybody ever done any camera trapping? Yeah, that's good fun. That is good fun. When it works, it's good fun. I love camera traps. I always think you're asking a lot of a bit of kit. You're asking a camera to sit out in all weathers for potentially weeks or months on end. And the second something interesting happens, I want high quality footage, thank you very much. It's a lot to ask of a bit of kit, but nevertheless, we put them through their paces, and our camera trapping is really, really useful. We do it, you might have heard before, through a camera trap loan scheme. Well, perhaps my favourite piece of citizen science I've ever had the pleasure to work on. The camera trapping is, the camera trap loan scheme is a great scheme wherein volunteers borrow a camera trap and all the associated kit, the batteries and the memory cards and the padlock and all sorts. And they go out into an area of the forest we've assigned them, and they will monitor this camera for 6 weeks at a time, baiting it with eggs and jam and sardines. It's a strange routine, I know. What we do is we put the sardines out first of all. We flick the oil up and down the tree. You watch in case anybody sees you doing this. You'll have fun explaining it. You flick the oil up and around the tree, and then you smear the fish up and down the branches, and that's really acting as a lure. That smells, and believe me, when you get it on you, it does. That's going to draw in any nearby martens, and the jam and the eggs are hopefully going to encourage them to stay. The jam and the eggs are then replaced every week for about 6 weeks by those volunteers. And what we do this in a systematic way across the forest. We've divided the forest into 60 grid squares, and we've got a camera out in each one. And really all we're hoping to do is basically take a register. It's a presence-absence study. We're not trying to capture natural behaviour, because naturally I don't think Pine Martens will be scoffing little sardines. But nevertheless, what we are able to do is see where are Pine Martens present and where perhaps aren't they present. So this is the camera trap loan scheme for you. Obviously we get lots of other species too. There's quite a lot of wildlife in the forest. It's not just wildlife, but I'm legally not allowed to show you any walker footage, so we have to delete that straight away. We get other species taking the bait. Here's a fox. Now I have to tell you at this point, he does get out of there. But if we leave it there, I think that's £250 from you've been framed. Yeah? We get boar. Obviously we get a lot of boar. Now I live in Somerset where we don't have boar, and this, when I took over the project, was quite a novelty to me. It's worn off, but nevertheless, they are lovely to see. They are lovely to see. But of course, if you're lucky, this is what we're aiming for. You're going to play? There you go. That's a Pine Marten, in case you've been wondering all the way through. I hope you haven't. Sat there going, what's he on about? They're about the size of a cat, and this video I particularly like because it wonderfully demonstrates quite how nimble they are, considering this is pitch dark here. To bound around the branches like that, I can't do that. They are rather wonderful. This here is a mother and her older kit. Now, by this point, mother's got no collar on, and the kit's that bit more mature. It's very hard to tell who's who. I think, but I'm still never sure with this clip, this is mum, because the kit's that bit slighter. But it is hard. I thought it was them talking. I think it's children outside. But when they're a little bit younger, and when mum's got a collar on, it's much easier to tell which ones are the kits. So there's mum in the front, and here come the kits. Look at that. I told you they're learning the ropes at this point for the first few months. And these guys are pretty good at it already, this bounding between branches. Give it a year, these guys will be doing this in the dark like their mum. This clip plays itself a few times, and I never stop, I never interrupt it, because it's my favourite. They are very sweet. Now, I've mentioned already, I've given the game away slightly, but we have been pleased to confirm breeding success of our Pine Martens in the forest every year since their return. which has been fantastic news. It's not just a testament to the fact that the Pine Martens themselves are happy in the forest. We're not just happy with that, but they're obviously happy enough to raise a family here too, which is great. These, considering Mother's got a collar on, the eagle-eyed amongst you will be able to have worked out that if she's got a collar on, that means she came down come the autumn. So these kits were, shall we say, Scottish conceived, but forest born. So that's quite nice. These were among the first Pine Marten kits born in the forest for a very, very long time, and that's wonderful. I don't know if this clip's going to stop today. How long have we got? Shall we just 10 minutes? Okay, that's fine. What we'll move on to then, as I said, with these clips, if we can get a nice shot of those bibs, then we can identify the individual that we're looking at. They don't make it easy, because as you saw in any of those clips of Pine Martens I just showed you, not one of them could you get a clear shot of this bib. But nevertheless, we've got this catalogue of the bibs of all the Martens that we translocated. This is called the bibliography. That's good. That's good. That's the best one, isn't it? That's the best one. That's the best one. Right, okay. I need to take notes on this. But as I said, they don't naturally give you a good shot of how to of their bibs. We try. Obviously, this is the shot when they were on the veterinary table. This is the drawing we make from it. But this is the Marten in reality. All right, it's got a collar on there, but once the collar comes off, perhaps it gets a little bit easier. No, as you can see, they tend not to position themselves quite right. We've tried various different things, hanging tea strainers with peanut butter in from a branch, so they sort of lift their head up and show you it like that. You can guarantee what they do is they come along and do that instead. They don't play along, they really don't, but we try our best. Finally, have you had your lunch? Because we're really talking about poo now. The scat surveys are the last bit of what has become the bread and butter of our post-release monitoring. It's unfortunate to talk about bread and butter when we're talking about poo. Anyway, and it really is what it says on the tin. When it comes to monitoring many mammals in the world, scats, their poo, are often the best way to do it. You go out and have a look around. I mean, you know, if you live in an area with lots of dog walkers, it works. You find exactly where they've been. Pine Martens are less straightforward, but they do give us a helping hand. Pine Martens, they use their scats as a sort of territorial marker, so they'll do it in quite conspicuous places. They want the scent to carry, so they'll do it on raised points, on rocks and on logs, and sometimes in open tracks, where the wind will blow the scent to other nearby martens. So what we do is quite simply, we walk out along these forest tracks. We're not roving off through the trees and undergrowth to try and look for poo. We'll have no chance. But walking along the forest tracks, we can form a more systematic way of surveying the area. And we can walk up the track and back down again, looking for Pine Marten scat among the dog and fox and whatever else poo that's out there. Of course, we've got to be able to identify Pine Marten poo. Whose poo? That's another good one. Yeah, is that as good as why the why? Yeah, it was a delayed reaction there, but we'll work with it. We'll work with it. Okay, by the end of this year, this talk's going to be perfect. It's going to be on live at the Apollo. Anyway, Pine Marten scats, thankfully, are quite distinctive. They've got a few key characteristics. That kinked shape is one of them. You can just about tell in the picture here. I'm going to point at it. I'm going to smooth it. There we are. You can see this sort of gentle kinked shape to the Pine Marten scat. Most of their scats have that. And that's thanks to the Pine Marten's peculiar custom, and I'm not going to do it, of wriggling their hips every time they go to the toilet. Every time they do it, they wriggle their hips and the scat comes out in a little kinked shape. Very, very helpful feature. Unusual, all right, but everyone's got their quirks. We let them live. Nevertheless, it's helpful because that kinked shape is quite distinctive if you've got a nice good quality scat. What some people call a moist classic. That's another t-shirt. It's got a not unpleasant smell. It says a not unpleasant smell. It's important to remember here that we are still talking about poo, so that is perhaps generous. But I grant them that it's not like fox or dog poo. If you're out in the forest and you see a scat you think might be Pine Marten, you pick it up and it's fox, you'll know about it. You'll recoil and you'll be ringing me up going, I'm never looking for scats for you again. Pine Marten scat won't make you recoil like fox or dog scat will. It's almost got a sweet smell. Pine Martens historically were known as sweet marts to differentiate themselves from their smellier cousins. But nevertheless, Pine Marten scat, yeah, it can smell like damp hay. Wet fur is often compared to, which often it contains. And some people though perhaps very generously say it smells like Parma violets. That's why they're up there. You might have also heard that otter spray, it smells like jasmine tea. This is naturalist for you. We're a strange breed. Trying to go, oh, I've been out to smell it. It smells lovely, darling. She'd go, he's off smelling poo again. Anyway, as I said, they may contain fur, bones, and berries and seeds. These, like owl pellets, contain the non-digestible parts of the Pine Marten diet. And that's quite useful as well, because it means we can take them apart and understand what the Pine Martens have been eating. That's something we've still got to do later on down the line when we get a nice sample size of scats. We're going to be taking them apart and having a look. That's going to be a fun evening, I can tell you. But yes, that's a great way that we can monitor what our Pine Martens are up to and what exactly they're eating. The contents and colour obviously may vary because their diet does, seasonally and geographically. And all of this, looking for poo, chasing cameras, checking den boxes when they're empty, all of this work is helping us to build up a picture of exactly where the Pine Martens are. See, that's building up a picture? Yeah? Don't worry. Building up a picture of exactly what the state the Pine Marten population is in nowadays, exactly where they're at and where they're headed to next. So we are winding down now, and I think quite well timed. I'm pleased with myself there. We have to, of course, give special thanks to our main project partners. There are lots of organisations that were involved, as I mentioned earlier. Forestry England, Vincent Wildlife Trust and the Woodland Trust. We really, literally couldn't have done it without them. It's been wonderful. In future, well, our project officially comes to an end at the end of May this year, at which point I get shot, or what's the process? I'm dispatched in some sort of way. But that's not the end for the Pine Martens. That's the important thing here. The monitoring is ongoing and will be ongoing. We're not washing our hands of these guys at any point. We're going to still be trapping, camera trapping. We're going to be doing scat surveys. We're going to be checking those den boxes every year until we get bored and they fall out the trees. And then we'll replace them and carry on. We've got ourselves into a lot of work here. But anyway, that's that. We're going to be monitoring these things going forward. One of the biggest focuses of a lot of conservation work nowadays is to increase and improve landscape connectivity. I've already mentioned that that's one of the biggest issues that Pine Martens have had historically. It's one of the biggest issues that a lot of species have had and still face. I could have spoken to you about anything today, and I'd be talking about how do we help them? Connectivity. We need more habitat, we need better quality habitat, and it needs to be more joined up. So that's something that we're really working on now. We're doing some interesting research into the landscape features that Pine Martens are happy to use and how they disperse across a landscape, so that we can think about our landscape scale conservation methods in future and how we manage the land to help species like the Pine Marten continue to expand. And hopefully what we're building towards is a nice resilient population once again. As I said, we're predicting that the Pine Martens in the Forest of Dean will meet up with the Mid Wales population at some point, if they haven't already. You saw how quickly they moved in those radio tracking radio tracking charts. And there are other reintroduction projects already planned, not for this area. You might have heard of the Two Moors project down in Devon and Somerset on Dartmoor and Exmoor. That's very exciting in its feasibility phase at the moment, but fingers crossed we'll have more releases down there. If they get the go-ahead, then with a population in the Forest of Dean, with one in Devon and Somerset and one in the New Forest, which is already there, we should be forming quite a resilient Pine Marten population down here in the southwest again, which I think, and I hope I've convinced you, is good news. Yes. Yeah? Good? Right, I'm going to go now. If you want to find out any more at all, you can always email me. Well, you can't always email me because, as I said, I'm gone from May. So up until May, you can email me, but we've got our website. It's probably the best way. It's Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust /Project Pine Marten. That's where all the information, all of those feasibility studies, all the reports that have come out, they're all on there. You can read them in all the wonderfully exciting detail. There's YouTube videos and everything. So enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.